We got to spend about a half hour in the Oval Office with President Bush. Wonderful man, and just incredible things I'll write about in my memoirs that struck me as we're sitting there. You really don't comprehend the pressure that is there. It's as if you're at the nucleus of American society. And everything that occurs in the Oval Office, you can feel all of America concentrating on that. So it really brings this high level of respect. And a lot of the things I thought about were things that occurred in the Oval Office that shouldn't have gone on there. But after that, private time, President Bush said, send in the press. And if you can see, thus began the expansion of Mr. Buckles' fame and notoriety. There were about, I would estimate, 300,000 stories written about the day in Washington, D.C. This is the unveiling of the portrait collection in the Pentagon with Sect F. Gates, and ironically enough, this gentleman over here, serves for the United States Army and is from Grand Rapids. So then after that, I said to Mr. Buckles, we really need to go see the only symbol to your generation in Washington, D.C., the only memorial to your generation in Washington, D.C., and that was a crumbling memorial I'd never seen before. This is Mr. Buckles' first look at that memorial. This is him at the base of it. So that turned into a 4-year journey that is pretty incredible. It's a local memorial to the residents of District of Columbia. The names of the base are 499 local people that lost their lives. It's located halfway between the Korean Memorial and the World War II Memorial. And we fought for and advocated for and got $3 million to get that restored. And the original concept was to expand it and make it the DC and national memorial area. But that then turned into a political game in which Eleanor Norton from Washington, D.C. and Mayor Gray turned it into an issue about voting rights for Washington, D.C. And we became homeless, so to speak, looking for a World War I memorial. So this is with Congressman Poe of Texas, my director from Washington, D.C., in September of '09, discussing the concept of expanding it. It really was a abandoned memorial. There were homeless camps right next to it. It was covered with algae. I've got a piece of it on my desk in Grand Rapids to remind me. But Mr. Buckles' fame grew, and the kids in the nation kind of adopted him because he was of an age that could be related, the age of 15 and 16 when he went to World War I. He began receiving thousands of emails and thousands of notes, and was featured in Weekly Reader and Encyclopedia Britannica did an entire website about him. And these are some kids that flew up from Texas with some money raised to help restore that memorial on the mall. And this is just about 1 week's worth of fan mail that kind of came in for Mr. Buckles with his daughter Susanna, and it was really a challenging thing trying to decide what to do. There were so many gracious notes and so many wonderful extensions to Mr. Buckles and invitations, and he went to Mount Rushmore and watched the fireworks in the last year of his life, and flew down to Kansas City. We saw the wonderful museum there for World War I. Then he was honored in the United States Capitol with Harry Reid, and that was a shoulder-to-shoulder, standing room only event. And at that time, after that, 2 things occurred that would start us down a path of really revelations of American history. One, Senator Burr from the Carolinas came up and said, when you die, which was somewhat odd, because I was standing next to Mr. Buckles when he handed him the resolution, and he was still living, but he said, when you die, we'd like you to lie in the rotunda in honor. So that was one thing that occurred, so that was set in motion in '09. And then the other thing that occurred was Senator Ted Poe of Texas, who you previously saw, came up and said, I heard about that memorial because Bob Dole talked about it and said, I want to help get it restored and I want to help with that fight. So those 2 things started at this event here, which ultimately led to a very interesting and unique moment in American history. we started the campaign to have a memorial in Washington, D.C. alongside of the other memorials, thinking that Washington, D.C. could at least see clearly on a veterans cause. Kansas City has a wonderful memorial called the Liberty Memorial. It's a 200-plus foot tower to World War I. And they decided that they wanted to be the World War I memorial, and there should be no other World War I memorial. And they set forth an effort to block our memorial effort in Washington, D.C. Backed with them, you'll see on the back here are some VFW caps. The VFW is based in Kansas City. They chose to sit on the opposite side of the room and not speak to their oldest member, and they indeed testified against the last World War I veteran of the United States in opposition to a national memorial in Washington, D.C. for World War I. So that is consumed most of my life for the past 4 years on a volunteer-only basis. So this is a moment when Mr. Buckles, the D.C. politicians didn't quite understand that we need to honor veterans, so they actually asked Mr. Buckles to come testify in Senate at the age of 108 to say, why should we have a memorial to 5 million veterans? So this is that moment. So when Mr. Buckles passed on, there were 5 resolutions, including the one introduced in 2009, for Mr. Buckles to lie in the rotunda. And we didn't get contacted by the United States government for about 3 days after Mr. Buckles' death. We had been in meetings for 2 to 3 years prior to this to prepare for the moment. And those 5 resolutions were all denied by the Speaker of the House, and Mr. Buckles was not allowed in the rotunda. So this was over in Arlington. He ended up lying in the basement chapel at Arlington where President Obama and Vice President Biden came over and paid respects. So this is his daughter. It's bad you guys can't see it all over here. It's really one of my favorite shots of my career. But his daughter's basically looking out, observing Arlington, and this is Mr. Buckles being brought off. Being led up to the grave here. The Native Americans, the Blackfeet Nation, interesting. They came to the home to stand by the side of the Buckles family. And this is them performing a ceremony as Mr. Buckles' casket was about to be laid in. But they went to the steps of the Capitol and observed 110 seconds of silence in basically opposition to what Speaker of the House did to the veterans. But it's kind of interesting. As they walked up to be photographed on the steps with me, one of the Capitol guards with a submachine gun says, "What are you here for?" And the Native Americans looked at it and said, "We're not happy with our government. We're here to take our land back." So in the midst of grieving, there were some profound American moments. So we eventually, for the 3rd time, got the Frank Buckles Memorial Act introduced. The Frank Buckles Memorial Act would have done 2 things. It would have 3 things. Initially, it was to create the National Memorial in Washington, D.C. It was to give Kansas City recognition also as a national memorial. And it would have also created a Centennial Commission, which was added on to our bill in the last year. So this is Congressman Ted Poe discussing the vote for the memorial. It passed Congress about 2 weeks before Christmas, went over to Senate. Senate looked at it and said, nope, we're not going to have a memorial to World War I anywhere. It was blocked by Senator Toomey of Pennsylvania, Claire McCaskill, and Roy Blunt from Missouri decided, no, we will not have memorials, we'll allow a commission only. So from there, the Frank Buckles Memorial Act went back over to Congress, and we instructed them, well, if you're not fulfilling Mr. Buckles' dream, we'd like his name removed. And this is the speech on New Year's Eve of Congressman Ted Poe explaining about the need for a memorial, and they passed the Frank Buckles Memorial Act with no memorials in it. So we have a Centennial Commission coming up, and our hope is that the Centennial Commission will also endorse the concept of a memorial in Washington, D.C. in the vote going on. There were a few nays to the Centennial Commission. One of them was Justin Amash, who I go to church with, and I discussed this the week before with him, and he was quite upset that they would remove memorials from a memorial law, and that is his explanation for his nay, which I said to him this Sunday I would have voted the same way.